Anyway, I recollect you opened all the cupboard, I saw all the fans, and I photographed them for my fan collection. Now, let me also say right at the beginning that Ms. Professor Deborah Swallow is also in the advisory committee of the JD Center of Art. We're very grateful. We used to have the Meet Artists program for more than 20 years in Bhubaneswar in our rented place, only for the people of Bhubaneswar. And because of the lockdown, it's all online, which is in a way very good that it has opened up its doors to the rest of the world. Opened all the cupboards, I saw all the fans, and I photographed them for my.
You're muted. Baba, you're muted. Siddharth, you need to unmute. Yeah.
Talk about Jensen.
Yeah. So sorry, there was a bit of a technical glitch, and I'll just start from there. GD Center of Art is delighted to collaborate with the India International Center for its Meet the Artist program. Professor Deborah Swallow is the director of the Courtauld Institute of Art, London, and is also a member of the JDC's advisory committee. She is the guest for today's 247th Meet the Artist program that started about 19 years ago. She will speak on Art for All, Samuel Courtauld, Collecting and Public Patronage. The MTA is being shown live on Zoom and on YouTube today. JDC is envisioned as a unique art center that aims to preserve and exhibit its large collection of folk, tribal, traditional, and contemporary art all under one roof. It is currently under construction in Bhubaneswar, Odisha. MTA is an in-house program of JDCA where invited artists, craftspersons, or scholars share their work, experiences, and insights through an illustrated talk. Since 2001, 246 Meet the Artists have taken place on the second Saturday of every month. Currently, our sessions, as Jatanji said, are being held online. Professor Deborah Swallow, or Debbie as she's popularly known and fondly known, is a Märit Rausing director of the Courtauld Institute of Art, London, founded in 1932. The Courtauld is UK's leading specialist institution for research and study in the history of art, architecture, and conservation, with an art gallery and a world-renowned art collection. Its alumni lead various public and private art institutions worldwide. Before joining the institute, Professor Swallow worked for 21 years in the Indian and Asian departments at the Victorian Albert Museum and 8 years in the Cambridge University Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. She first visited Odisha, and this is a lovely connection that we have, in 1969 to teach English literature for a year as a VSO volunteer at Utkal University. Then, following a change of discipline, she returned to undertake anthropological research experiences which changed the direction of her life. And with that, we would like to welcome you, Debbie, onto you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Siddhartha and Jatinda.
You're mute, Debbie. You have to unmute yourself. Yeah.
I'm not.
Oh, yeah. No, it's fine. It's fine.
Okay, can you hear me now? Am I? Oh, good, good. Thank you so much, Siddhartha. Thank you, Jatinda, for this lovely invitation and for the opportunity of seeing you again. And thank you to everybody who has joined this talk. I see many, many old friends in the audience, and just wish that this was actually in real time and real space. Well, it's in real time, but it was in real space. Given the link between the JDCA and Odisha and my experience there and the IC, this is really bringing together two really important elements in my Indian life. And I wanted to use it just to pay tribute to those who started off my life in Odisha. The wonderful late Professor Vidyabhushan Das and Professor Prabhat Nalini Das first had the idea of inviting VSO young people from England to Odisha and to spend time there in the educational sphere. And I was one of those very lucky people. Without that decision, without their invitation, my life would have been absolutely and totally different. And they and their family were wonderful, both employers and supporters to me, both then and when I returned to Odisha sometime later. I'd also, though, like to express my indebtedness to two other distinguished academics, the late Professor Joshua Darabagchi of later Judd of Courtauld University, who was my English tripos supervisor in Cambridge, who introduced me to the late Professor Gaur-Kishore Das, who was then completing his PhD in Cambridge, who then introduced me to his wonderful extended family, who gave me several of their homes, as it were, as bases in Orissa also, while doing my fieldwork in the early 1970s. So it's lovely to see everybody here, and I'll move on to my topic. But as I said, I wouldn't be at the Courtauld if that first visit to Odisha had not happened, I'm quite sure. Let me just share my screen with you. I can get it open. Right. I've spent my whole life to date working, other than my early education, working for and in institutions. And of course, while at school and university, I was also in institutions, observing them and the people that make them, playing a part in them and watching their ups and downs. And in my own way, trying to support creative and constructive change. As an anthropologist and ethnographer, my ability to observe, I think, is probably fairly well honed. But I also tend to use extended anecdote to make an argument. So I hope you'll forgive me for focusing on the one institution that I currently lead, the Courtauld Institute of Art, a college of the University of London with a public gallery and a world-renowned collection. In November this year, the first and major stage of an ongoing project will be complete with the reopening of the Courtauld Gallery after 3 years of closure. It'll be a moment of celebration at achieving the first major outcome of a project which was first conceived almost 10 years ago. Much remains to be done, but it's a real milestone. And we certainly need to thank all of those who've worked immensely hard and creatively to ensure the success of this project. And I think it will be indeed worthy of praise. However, in the 3 years since we closed the gallery and moved all our educational activities to a different temporary campus, and the project became, as it were, publicly visible, much has changed in our worlds, and that's the worlds that we all share in this audience, some of which perhaps more than others. In the UK, we've experienced the first effects of Brexit, for which the majority of the population, of course, voted in 2017, but which threatens the union with Scotland, with Northern Ireland, and the future of the United Kingdom itself. Like the rest of the world, we've been living through COVID, which has had many effects on our society, undoubtedly in many cases widening social and economic divisions in the population, and here in the UK, giving huge challenges to its hitherto buoyant cultural world. At a yet higher level, the evidence of climate change is incontrovertible. And I think we're all having to take notice of that. And the UK is, of course, hosting COP in November this year in Glasgow. And in many parts of the world, certainly in the UK and in North America, the Black Lives Matter movement has significantly challenged comfortable Western elites, radically moving the needle on debates about racism, about post-colonial society, about slavery, and about social and economic inequalities, and the hinterland to the benefits that some of us have enjoyed for many, many years. So, in a way, having made a big investment in a building project, there's a further question: how do we at the Courtauld justify the huge investment we've made, and how do we really ensure that it's relevant to today's world and is not just another elite project? The Courtauld, I joined in 2004 had a distinctly elite and elitist reputation and had historically been unsympathetic to women as colleagues. It was overwhelmingly white, middle class, with a predominantly white male professoriate, but a predominantly female student body. And the institution's curriculum and collection were largely Western. It was ironic that I'd been appointed, given my rather untraditional background for the Courtauld, but the panel, at least in part, were clearly voting for change. Of course, like all such generalizations, the truth about the Courtauld was much more nuanced. And in many ways, this was a friendly, generous, embracing institution. In fact, also, by the time I arrived in 2004, several colleagues working in the modern and contemporary history of art had expanded their research and supervision, with students from all over the world working on global contemporary art. And our Conservation of All Paintings department was working not merely in the Eastern Mediterranean and beyond, but also in China. I joined the Courtauld from the wonderful experience at the V&A, slightly daunted by its reputation for excellence, and in practice, by the sheer intellectual strength and debating power of my colleagues, made it difficult initially to propose radical change without possible loss of support from those key stakeholders, the academic community, who were not opposed to change, but concerned that change would entail the loss of the things that they held dear, the specialisms and the sheer quality of the work on Western art history. It was implied, if I could bring additional money to make it happen, then maybe. Everything seemed to depend on raising money. So though the seeds of all I felt we needed to do were there, it took me some years, or it took us some years, to articulate and secure buy-in to a program of larger scale physical and organizational transformation. And even now, given that the delivery of changes requires significant fundraising, difficult choices and prioritization, and has taken more time and more money than initially anticipated, it hasn't always been possible to keep all our stakeholders happy. As my senior team and I started to articulate the transformation we wished to achieve and engage the wider community in the thinking, we did what is often done and sought inspiration from the history of our origins and the reasons we've come into being. So I want to tell you a little bit about that, as it has proved inspirational. The Courtauld emerged as a concept in the later 1920s when a number of people deeply involved in the UK's art world, but with international experience, realized that although the United Kingdom had many of the world's finest art collections, unlike Germany or the United States, it offered no university education in the history of art. Although very privileged themselves, they felt that it was this essential development. Art was to become more than a pastime for those like themselves. Three key individuals emerged, all collectors, all significant, each with a different focus and contribution, but with a unified intention. With support from other luminaries of the international art world of the time, these men, all of whom had little noted and underpraised, but influential and strongly supportive wives, College of the University of London. The first on the left was Arthur Viscount Lear Ferrum, a diplomat and administrator who was probably the one who really made the whole project happen. He was the doer, the organizer. The second on the right-hand side is Robert Witt, a lawyer, a rather drier character who collected works on paper, but was probably very important in the drawing up of various trust deeds and so on. And the third, Samuel Courtauld, the industrial magnate and great collector of impressionist works of art. I'll talk about Lee first. It was really perhaps his idea, most of all, which then he inspired Courtauld with. The idea for a higher education institution with its own gallery dedicated to the history of art. He was a politician to the core. He'd been diplomat and had made a very good marriage to a rich American. And in 1917, he had given his home, Chequers, an estate in Buckinghamshire, to the nation for use as the country retreat by the serving prime minister. And many of you will realize it still remains so to the day. Soon after that, Lee retired from his distinguished political career and then devoted the remainder of his life to art, building up a second art collection with fierce independence. He had very strong belief in his own skills, which were indeed considerable, and emphatically asserted the place of the private collector against self-appointed experts. But his approach was undoubtedly academic, albeit clearly inspired too by the chase, as it were, the chase to acquire works. And he made some superb acquisitions already with the Courtauld in mind. I'll give you two examples. Botticelli's Holy Trinity with Saints is the only altarpiece by the artist in the United Kingdom. Like many of his acquisitions, it had a fascinating provenance. He was very, very concerned about that. It was originally commissioned by the Arte dei Medici dei Deli Speziali for the Church of Santa Elisabetta delle Convertite in Florence, a church and monastery housing fallen women, fallen prostitutes, who had converted from their sad lives to those of honesty, and whose patron saint was Mary Magdalene, who appears in the painting. Another good example of what he did was to acquire a pair of wedding chests in their complete form and with full provenance, which you see on the right. I mean, we actually know the date at which they was manufactured, the names of all the artists and craftsmen involved with them, and the specific marriage between the Morelli and Nerli families, which had instigated this, their manufacture and preparation. And another important advocate for the Courtauld was what became the Courtauld was Courtauld's neighbour in Portman Square, the lawyer and drawings collector, Sir Robert Witt, whose pride and joy was his collection of photographic reproductions of paintings, which you can see in these green boxes and which still are in the libraries of the Courtauld, with his supportive wife sitting very appropriately in the deep background of this painting. When I say appropriately, I hope you see the ironic quotation marks around it. However, without any doubt, the most attractive and inspiring of the three, in terms of their certainly in terms of relevance for today and the future, was Samuel Courtauld himself. He was a man of imagination, passionate love for art, idealistic conviction and integrity, and immense generosity of spirit and purse, whose name, of course, we carry, and who gave both his house and his collection to set us up as an academic and to be public institution. He comes from a fascinating background. His successors were Huguenots, French Protestants who fled religious persecution in the late 17th century and settled in London and prospered there as silversmiths. And the women too were silversmiths. This is Louisa Courtauld, not just the men. And in fact, that recognition of the role of women runs right through the family's life. One of his relatives was a leading suffragette. The second stage of the family's fortunes came with the development of in the late 18th century, moving into the textile business, where they moved into Essex and produced silk crepe and made a mountain of money when Queen Victoria moved into mourning after the death of the Prince Consort, and it became essential fashion for everyone to wear it, and they were one of the main suppliers. But the biggest move was their move into the in the early 20th century, where they specialized where they acquired the patents for a revolutionary new artificial fabric called viscose or rayon. And as a result, within very few decades, Courtauld Limited was transformed from a successful family-run manufacturing business into one of the largest textiles and chemical companies in the world. It had research and production facilities all across the United Kingdom. You see here the Coventry factory, as well as a vastly profitable American subsidiary and numerous international partnerships. Courtauld was chairman of the company from 21 to 46. I've shown you a picture of his wife. And it was actually she who in 1922 bought the couple's first modern paintings. By the end of that decade, they had formed one of the greatest private collections of Impressionist and post-impressionist art ever assembled, of over 60 paintings and 30 drawings, as well as sculptures and prints. The collection featured seminal works by all the major artists associated with these movements, including Manet's A Bar at the Folies Bergère, Van Gogh's self-portrait with bandaged ear, Gauguin's Théréia and Nevermore. And Courtauld was particularly devoted to the work of Paul Cézanne, assembling a group of 11 paintings by the artist, as well as important watercolors. And that collection was really put together in that one decade of the 1920s. What was interesting is that Impressionism as a movement was still, though 50 years old, regarded with hostility by a rather insular British art establishment. Courtauld saw things differently. He really was hugely inspired by these works, and with his passion for them, he wanted to live with them. He thought they were a new renewal of the tradition of Western painting, and he and his wife gathered the paintings in their very smart home called Hume House, a magnificent London townhouse designed by the great architect Robert Adam at 20 Portman Square near Oxford Street. I think this gives you a sense of how he lived with the works, and he had works in all rooms, all major rooms of his house, including his bedroom. He actually wrote poetry about them. He really, as I think he felt these paintings in a way that perhaps we don't all do all the time, but really was very sincere about it. But he also had a very, within the constraints of his day and his class, now you have to stress that, had a very radical vision about the renewal of society and the role of art. He was a very private man, but he vigorously promoted progressive views on education, welfare, social mobility, and labor relations, and wrote and lectured about them in later life. He saw art as a powerful antidote to the degrading effects of industrial capitalism and consumerism. Now, of course, you will see the ironies of that, given his own, the source of his own wealth, and these are ironies which, of course, I will talk about later, and which we continue to live with. His wife, Elizabeth, used her sort of part of their wealth to make the best classical music available to new audiences, supporting the London Philharmonic Orchestra, which was not then called that. But Samuel was particularly keen to that the art he loved should be widely enjoyed. So in addition to forming his own collection, starting to form it at that stage, in 1923, he also established something called the Courtauld Fund, which over the subsequent years, under his direction, acquired many of the greatest Impressionist and post-impressionist paintings now in the National Gallery in London. So without Courtauld, the UK really would have, other than a wonderful collection in Wales, would have very little in the way of Impressionist or post-impressionist paintings. He was absolutely significant in that development. But similarly, he was determined that in future his private collection should be donated for public benefit. And I know for myself from a personal anecdote, when I've heard it from the man himself, when his son-in-law to be, R.A. Butler, who became Home Secretary in the UK, went to seek his permission to marry his daughter Sydney, Courtauld, and you can almost see him in that picture of the sitting room receiving this young politician, was told, young man, if you're by any chance thinking of that you're marrying my daughter because of the art and the inheritance you're going to get from it, forget it. This is all going to go into the public domain. This was told with a joke and no doubt with a certain amount of overemphasis, but I'm sure it was in part true. What he wanted to do was to make sure that this collection that he had made went for scholarship and education, and that it would become one of the founding elements of the Courtauld Institute of Art. Now, there are some ironies at this point in time. This is the house that Courtauld and his wife lived in, very grand house indeed. She, very sadly, the concept of the Courtauld was being developed by 1929, 1930. In 1931, Elizabeth died. And as there was no immediate offer of space in the University of London, Courtauld presented this nascent institute with a place to be, at his home, for which he gave the remainder of a long lease. And he established the Hume House Society, now the Samuel Courtauld Trust, in Elizabeth's memory, endowing it with the majority of his art collection. And the Courtauld Institute was established in 1932 under the aegis of the University of London. And it offered a rich curriculum in both Western art history and aspects of Asian art history and broader arts of the world. It had a department for conservation and technical study. And it was the vision that the students who trained at this new institution would become teachers and lecturers, museum curators and directors, conservation specialists, writers and critics, and that they'd spread the understanding and enjoyment of art as part of the creation of a more just and humane society. The collection, of course, for some time was not easily accessible. Ironically, it was hanging and probably still in the walls of the new institute. Over subsequent decades, further collections were donated in addition to those of Courtauld, and Witt, with the likelihood of more to follow. And the most important of which were those from Roger Fry, not shown here, which included some artifacts from India, Africa, and Melanesia, a very small number. The Gambier-Paris collection of late medieval, early Renaissance art, and which included Islamic metalware, and the Prince's Gate collections from Antoine Ceylon. The next stage of but at this point, there was a sort of a new challenge. It was realized that they couldn't keep on hanging these amazing works of art in the, or ones they were hoping to get in the house, in Hume House. And so a new solution was thought. A scheme was drawn up for a building in Woburn Square, and this is what the bit of it that was eventually built. It was intended for both the Courtauld and the Warburg Institutes, which in 1933, both Lee and Courtauld had done much to rescue from Hamburg when threatened by the rise of the Nazi regime. And it would have a dedicated gallery for the Courtauld on top of the building, alongside facilities for teaching and research. The scheme was only partially executed. A gallery was created. The Warburg took up residence. And ironically, almost the only access to the gallery was via a very hidden lift with a very hidden door on the side of the larger Warburg building, which though open to the public, was visible and known to really a very small segment of the population. As the collection developed, so too did the Institute, which was still sitting in Portman Square, spearheading the expansion of teaching in art history throughout the UK in the mid-20th century. And Courtauld trained graduates did indeed lead major national and international institutions and spread across the world to teach and lead academic departments of art history. Central to this success was a singularly controversial figure. Of my predecessors, he sadly is the only one who is well known by name. I should name the others because to make my point, but Peter Lasker, Michael Kaufman, and Eric Fernie, all eminent scholars of the arts of medieval Europe, and James Cuno, now primarily defined by his roles at the Art Institute of Chicago and the Getty, but they're typically forgotten, leaving this longest serving director, the art historian Anthony Blunt, notorious as having been both the surveyor of Her Majesty's Queen's pictures and as a Russian spy, as the defining figure in the Courtauld institutional and academic history. Viewed as an art historian and critically, Blunt established the extremely high standards of scholarship which now define the Courtauld, even though the scope and range of methodological and theoretical approaches have changed. A scholar of 17th century Italy, he also embraced, was very knowledgeable of the modern and contemporary, but his concept of art history was rigorously Western, and he abandoned the Courtauld's founding mission to cover the arts of the world, devolving to SOAS, the academic posts and library assets it had developed between 1932 and the mid-1950s. Coincidentally, and as he retired, of course, by now in disgrace, the Courtauld's lease on Hume House was heading towards expiring, which it was going to do in the mid-1980s. Which created both a challenge and an opportunity. At first, it was hoped that they could complete the building in Woburn Square, but planning constraints prevented it, and new thinking had to happen, and this was the outcome, that the Courtauld would move to Somerset House, the large complex on the north bank of the river between the city and Westminster, designed by William Chambers, originally in the late 18th century as a home for the Navy and tax officers at a time of British colonial expansion, and one of the finest Georgian buildings in London. A cultural heritage arena badly in need of renovation and reuse. It was still being occupied partly by the tax officers, but partly was empty and semi-derelict. And it's in this northern block that the Courthold is now located. Appropriately, the Grand North Block was originally conceived and built for the Royal Academy of Arts and other societies of the Enlightenment, the Royal Society and the Antiquaries. The Courthold relocated there by 1990, and the subsequent 30 years have witnessed the steady growth of both the institution's academic activities, degree programs, student numbers, and the gradual globalization of the curriculum, greater research engagement with the public, and a range of collaborative research projects. The galleries program has expanded with additions to the collection, publications, research-based exhibition programs, and working not only with the historic collection, but also with leading contemporary artists. But 20 plus years later, when after a few years at the court, I realized there was a continuing challenge. With the growth of numbers and growth of ambitions, it was clear that these premises were not ideal. They were sort of grand, but invisible. Only 45% of the space was accessible for anybody with a disability. They were overbusy, not of the international standard by now expected of a leading cultural institution. Shabby chic was not really acceptable when students were paying high fees and visitors asked to buy expensive tickets. So here was the dilemma. Real physical change was needed, some expansion was healthy, a widening of range of activity, of exhibition scope, of collections was important. We needed to diversify our audiences, our student body and staff, and somehow the physical infrastructure felt to be a hindrance and a risk. So the institution had choices, could do nothing and muddle along. I remember one trustee saying that the best work was done when colleagues were all hugger-mugger and having to sort of bump into each other. Though another one roundly contested it, that argument, and gave one of the most articulate expressions I can recall of the value of architecture, spaces and buildings and the aura of buildings could help shape cultures and affect outcome. So if we weren't going to stay, if we weren't going to do nothing, what we were to do? To move again, less than 25 years after getting there, to go elsewhere, to go to King's Cross where there was redevelopment, but we'd actually missed that boat, to go to the Olympic Park after the Olympics, to go to West London, to put our bets on Battersea Power Station, and there were several others, or to redevelop the current site. The advantages of that were we could capitalize on the location. By now, Somerset House was being redefined as a cultural centre. It was next door to King's College London and LSE, providing the potential for an improved educational and cultural quarter and partnerships, close to the British Museum, close to the National Gallery, the National Portrait Gallery, Covent Garden, Theatreland, and linked to the South Bank by the Waterloo Bridge. You can imagine the debate, but following detailed options appraisals, the board opted to stay, accepting the challenges were great, but the benefits were ultimately greater. So we stayed and we took on the challenge to redevelop our building. And the challenge it was, and it has been. By 2015, we appointed architect Sterling Prize winners Witherford Watson Mann, who worked with the inherent challenges of the building and developed a beautiful scheme which embraces the realities of the 18th century building, but with the aim of ensuring that it is accessible and visible and appropriately repurposed for 21st century usage. Now, just to give you some idea, basically it looks like a coherent single entity, but it is in fact a series of vertical houses. More than that, some of the vertical houses were divided even as they were being built. The Royal Academy was separate from the Royal Society. And you'll see the rather strange shapes the Royal Society had. The Royal Society and the Antiquaries had to share a stairway and a room of entrance and were at loggerheads as soon as they got in there. There are 42 different levels in the building. There are about 18 staircases, but quite a few of them not very helpful ones. Not an easy building to work in. So the aim was to try and get some coherence in the building and to find as well routes around it, which would enable interaction across the whole space and between all its inhabitants, whether they were conservators, art historians, curators, the public, or the students. It was also aiming to ensure that it would become much more fully, even if it couldn't be 100% accessible, it should be way above 90% fully accessible, and to have really good circulation, and the building should be legible. And ultimately, the aim was a physical and cultural transformation. We launched on this, we raised money, and I learned a new word. In my world, hitherto, discoveries of whatever sort, including archaeological, have been exciting and positive. But I soon discovered that discoveries in an architectural context, when you're renovating an old building, are unhappy things, and that they always have big pound signs, money signs against them. But sometimes they were indeed very exciting. And this was one of them, where we discovered the medieval cesspits, which go back to sort of late medieval cesspits from the even the Tudor palaces almost, which are of huge scale and which included a number of small items of a horse's head, some rings, some ceramics, and so on, which we will probably display in due course. But that was a major function of the work that we had to do as we started to open up the building. The craft of getting a building accessible goes down to very, very delicate detail, gentle ramping. There are 14 to 16 steps between the street level and getting it anywhere near a lift before, so all sorts of interventions had to take place in the vestibule that not only provides our entrances but leads into the wider Somerset House. We did a very significant structural intervention in the lower ground floor, opening up vaults and breaking through in the middle of the building to allow for level access at the lower ground level, which required taking up the road, providing an engineered bridge for all the trucks to keep coming into Somerset House while we continued to work below. But the outcome, I think, is going to be magical. Despite having so many stairs, in order to get usable stairs down to the lower ground floor, we had to build yet another stair, which is a cantilevered stair, to keep in keeping with the building, which actually is very beautiful, but complex. We needed infrastructure material. The storage, totally transformed storage for the collections, and something which gives me particular delight, which is beautifully engineered services, all fully mapped and documented, unlike anything that had been there hitherto. We've created exhibition spaces. We were allowed by Historic England to take out a floor, an original floor. We've hidden fireplaces behind walls. And this is part of a new suite, which has a second room as well, which will allow us to do larger and more flexible exhibitions and a better flow of people. We've conserved, restored the key elements of the fabric of the building that are highly rated, particularly the main stairs, which are some of the most beautiful elements in the building. And we have restored the original Royal Academy Great Room, the largest original public space in Britain and probably in Europe at that time, which dates back to the 1780s, which we had carved up in an early stage in our history and some as well semi-destroyed, but it will now be fully restored. We had to move the whole academic institution out to another building near King's Cross, where we're still operating for the moment, and you can imagine the work all that entailed. By the time we had moved everything out in 2018, we had already raised nearly £13 million, but we still had quite a lot to raise. But now, despite delays due to COVID, despite increased costs, and thanks to further generous benefactors, we are opening the gallery late this year before launching on our next fundraising challenge for the rest of the building and the libraries. Now, fundamental to the thinking is that this isn't just an architectural project. It's not just been to produce a magical building or physical experience, however important those are. It's always been intended as part of a larger people-based transformation, and that is the more challenging.
Lies.
It's very easy for us in the UK, I think, to be at times critical or sometimes even irritated by what appears to be intrusive, politically correct governmental initiatives or the overly engineered social change intentions of semi-autonomous quangos such as our National Lottery or Historic England. But actually, this has been an amazing experience. I deeply respect the thoughtfulness of Historic England in understanding that no historic building is of use unless it has a purpose. And they have been given us huge support in making this happen while helping us find the means not to destroy historic evidence. That cesspit has been fully documented, but it has now been filled in and a floor built over it. And we have continued with the project. It is recorded, it's preserved within, as it were, mothballs, but can be accessed with difficulty and cost, of course, but it's there and it's known. And I have nothing but praise for our National Lottery Heritage Fund, which has given one of the largest single grants to us of our campaign, but also one of the largest they've given in recent years, for the role they've played in supporting us through their grant and opening our eyes to good ways of doing things. Demonstrating positive social impact and national social impact is as important to the National Lottery Heritage Fund as the demonstration of the value of conserving and restoring a historically significant building. I learned this the hard way. Our first two applications to the NLHF failed. Each time they gave invaluable feedback, encouraging us to expand our thinking rather than a brute rejection. And the outcome, I think, has been inspiring. What transformed our application and our ambition was a genuinely creative response to this challenge in thinking about the national role that we could and should have. This was the development of a network of partnerships across the UK, almost all in former industrial towns where Courtauld Limited had their major manufacturing centres, none of which, of course, were anymore in operation. So Belfast, Preston, Coventry, Hull, Wolverhampton and Braintree were the main ones. All in areas of deindustrialization at different points in the history, all with high social deprivation registers, most with substantial immigrant populations, both in the Commonwealth and the rest of the world, and all struggling in the late 20th and early 21st century to seek redefinition of their sort of purpose and their sort of core. Coventry is a really good example. I've shown you this versions of this picture before, but it was one of the very large centres of production. And as you see, proud of their tall chimney, the tallest in the country when built. In Coventry, we've had perhaps the longest relationship, and it continues, and it will continue. There are, hereafter. We've set up a series of projects. Coventry, here you see what's happened to the factory site. Since then, the facade of this building has been retained, but the site has been demolished, and there are housing plans, as there are for most of the sites where the factories were. But at Coventry, we've had a series of shared exhibitions, co-curated or curated by their teams, where they have themselves chosen works from the collection and have been involved sometimes with us, sometimes by themselves, with outreach, community engagement and interpretation activities for individuals and groups of all age. This exhibition, called Radical Drawing, brought together the collections from the Courthold and from Coventry and the University of Warwick. And this is depicting a day when a wonderful friend and collector and artist, Linda Carshan, who's one of whose works was in the exhibition, joined with young people for a project in which they participated and looked and worked together. But many of the projects like this one, also at Coventry, have involved making contact with the now rather elderly folk who still have their own memories of working, or their family members working with Courtauld Limited, engaging with the archive for the company and capturing oral history and making films and doing all sorts of engagement with them. Another major activity has been a volunteering one, which has been of mutual benefit to many, many people under Courtauld. This has involved over 1,000 individual volunteers to date, but has involved them in digitally photographing one of our largest photographic libraries, records of particularly of architecture, and they will all be put on the web, and creating material around them. And that has been a very inspiring volunteer project, which has brought in both individuals of all ages and walks of life, but also in which we've worked with a number of different communities, some with health problems, some with linguistic problems, and so on. And then we've had big events in Dundee and Belfast, what we call our resfest, our research festival, which have incorporated the whole range of the arts mimicked in the Courtauld itself. And the whole project has entailed a rigorous process of development of art, the interpretation that will be used in the gallery when it reopens. It's embedded new ways of working for many of us across the organisation. So where are we now? Before we close, we were doing a lot of work with young people, and that will certainly continue. We've always had the principle of making, the collection, once we had facilities to do so, more accessible to both to our own students, of course, and to scholars, and to then a wider community. And this is another example of what we have been doing and what we will, of course, want to do more of with yet better facilities when we open up. But the ongoing challenge is how to address the sort of the yet deeper issues of today, particularly the challenge of post-colonialism and racism. And there are some ironies, as you will realize, in that the site where we're based was absolutely at the heart of the colonial endeavour. What we don't have to deal with, if I can put it that way, is significant statues of those directly involved in the slave trade, as in the case of Bristol, which was the most visible reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement. This campaign had been brewing for many years. It didn't happen just overnight in Bristol, which involved taking down the statue and plunging it into the harbour. And the statue is now on display in a very different mode with its graffiti on it in a museum in Bristol. We still have a very Western focused collection. So how do we transform what we do, as well as our curriculum, as well as our community? In all of this, I feel that our students are leading the way. They've been phenomenally energetic about the institution's response to Black Lives Matter movement. They are well informed, they are critical, they are demanding in the very best of ways. And I just want to show something which looks wonderfully conventional for a particular reason. This is an image from one of the last exhibition mounted by our MA curating students in the gallery before we closed in 2018. It's called, the exhibition was called They're Not There. And the theme was to do with presence and absence. It was to do with history and memory. And there are many lovely works in it. The works are drawn from the collections of the sort of contemporary art collections owned by the Arts Council, who are always very generous with us, but also from our own collection. Most of the contemporary works, not all, but most of the contemporary works come from that Arts Council collection. This work by a British-Nigerian artist called Carl Ohiri looks like just a very benign set of photographs, family photographs, mounted rather beautifully in a fairly contemporary way. But when you know more about it, and look more closely, you see worrying things. This showcases a variety of vandalized Polaroids from his own mother's collection, and he calls the exhibition, the item, How to Mend a Broken Heart. Shortly after his parents' divorce, so he had a white British mother and a Nigerian father, Ohiri's mother reportedly started to blot out the father's image from the family photos, having escaped an abusive marriage. And looking very carefully, you can still see some punctures in the images from a stabbing pen, and elsewhere the words monkey and false. And the viewer is really left in a dilemma, left to wonder if these captions represent simply the despondency of a failed marriage, or despite this cross-race marriage, an internalized racism, the likes of which only emerges from the deepest wells of rage. Sorry. This is really, tough stuff. And I deliberately chose the picture of what I would call a middle-class white male, rather wickedly to demonstrate it. But it is exactly what's important about art and its ability to express things that are otherwise often impossible to articulate and to communicate. Not to find specific answers, but to push questions, make us ask questions at the deepest of levels. And of course, the ability to express the deepest of human feelings is critical to a humane and healthy society. This, of course, is what Manet and Van Gogh were doing. Both the bar and the self-portrait with bandaged ear are in their time really asking some of these same deep questions within that the context of a sort of social change in the case of Manet, the position of women, and Van Gogh to do with deep sort of mental turmoil and emotion. And their work can speak to everyone. And this is what Carl Ohiri has achieved in this work. So for us, I think the challenge is to ensure that what we do with the gallery and what we do with the institution as a whole is to keep up that sort of what I think remains a war, a battle for the arts, but a battle to ensure the arts are made relevant all the time, are allowed to be relevant all the time, and to make sure that we find the means, whether from philanthropy or from pushing governments to support that, even when, as in the case of the UK, the main focus is on science, technology, engineering, medicine. The arts are relevant to all of those, and without those, we have a poor life.
Ask anybody who selects this.
Thank you, Debbie. That was a lovely talk, and I think it ended in a very kind of a somber and a poignant thing, which is because often I think people think art is only frothy and it's only aesthetic, and it brings home, I think, how nuanced anything is in life, and especially art. Thank you for that. And I think there are a lot of participants here who have known you in many different times, and who also have followed the kind of different departments and different museums that you've headed. I'm just going to open it up to everyone else to ask. And I just wondered if you also wanted to talk anything about it before it got opened up to others, about, it was such a big transition, you being the head of the Asian department at the V&A, and being the director of collections at the Victor and Albert Museum, and then going to the Courtauld, which is such a different thing. If you wanted to say something about it, I know it is a complete departure from where you ended. But,
yeah, no, I tried to convey some of that in what I said, which was it was a big transition, and I think it was quite. I said maybe it helps now, but I guess my identity had become so sort of, if I can call it Indianized, if you'll forgive the word, that I felt probably rather like an alien within the camp when I first started at the Courthold. I mean, it was actually a very welcoming place, I have to say, ironically, but it was like sort of negotiating. Given that I started my life in association with India when I was all of just 21, most of my life up to that point had really had as much a focus and a point of reference as the subcontinent as Europe or the UK. And so it was almost like coming in as it was coming in as an outsider. And I mean, it's been very fascinating to be at the Courtauld. I suppose what I would love to have done was to do more faster, but life has to be practical, and you have, as I say, money is required for almost anything you want to do, and it doesn't come easy. So raising lots and lots of money has taken time. But I think we're sort of I think we're asking the right questions now, and we're going in the right direction. And I hope that will continue. But it was, and I missed the collections when I got to the Courtauld. I missed lots of things. That's why, of course, I kept on coming to India, and will continue to do so once COVID is safely manageable, if I can put it that way. But but I've learned a huge amount from my Courtauld colleagues, a huge amount, and I just wish I was sort of starting with all of that knowledge now, and I was a mere 30 now and could take all that knowledge and experience and move forward from now. That would be nice, but that's not the way life works. I think you're mute, Siddhartha.
Oh, sorry. Is there anyone who would like to pose a question to Debbie over here?
I can see Tasneem waving.
Yeah.
Hi, Debbie.
Hi, Tasneem.
So nice to see you.
And you too.
A very long time, and thank you for that wonderful talk. So what I wanted to ask you was, you've had to balance both an educational institution and a museum. And it sort of seems to me that the educational institution has got greater emphasis. Do you think that? And that is sort of better known. Has that been deliberate, or am I wrong? Of course, I don't live in London and I only visit. But you have to compete with all the great, of course, you have a fabulous collection. It's a very special, precious collection. But has that ever been something of concern to you? How do you balance the two? Where did you want to put your emphasis, especially coming out of a museum background? How did you reorient it? Did you have to go along with what was already given to you?
Great question, Tasneem, and you've got to one of the sort of fundamentals. I mean, the Courtauld is primarily, it is an institution. The gallery is part of the academic institution ultimately, but it was also, that's why going back to the mission and trying to understand the founder's intentions was really interesting. Is that it had a public, it always was intended to have a public remit, but obviously it wasn't. What Courtauld could have done was just to give all his collection to the National Gallery. So there was this interesting tension about, he gave some, he effectively gave some to the National Gallery, but he wanted the core of the collection to stay with the Education Institute. So the linkage between education and the gallery is key. Now, we probably have the strongest reputation in the world for an academic institution which effectively, either deliberately and overtly or indirectly, trains leaders of the museum and gallery worldwide. So the fact of a gallery being part of our remit, as well, they work together in that way. But there is a mismatch, of course, at between the range of the collection, which has been more restricted, to the now ever expanding range of what we teach. But then we sit in London and we have access to the British Museum, we have access to the National Gallery. We're not trying to compete with them, nor should we. And certainly this is not a point in history for the little Courtauld to go out and start buying works of art from all over the world, unless from the contemporary sphere. So you're right in that managing the balance of these elements has, and in some ways continues to represent a challenge in order to make give the Courtauld a stronger presence as a gallery, and also to use that as a way of sharing our research, but also attracting a wider population of people into the educational institution as students. We need to keep the two working together as closely as we can. So the investment in the building, that was what I meant about prioritization. We made the choice, we sort of had to make the choice to invest in the gallery side and our conservation laboratories first. It was the most expensive bit, and it was the one for which we were most likely to get some significant public funding, i.e. the National Lottery funding. And the upgrade and the renovation of the academic facilities is going to happen as a second stage. And there are tensions then internally, of course, because it looks as if you're favoring one over the other, because you can't do both at once. So that has been a challenge. But the where it is going to be really valuable is that the revised gallery is going to be so much more usable by everybody, by staff, by students, as well as by communities, as well as by curators. And in the course of doing the project, we have experimented much more with working across, with working together, with working in project teams, with working outside the box. It's not just the gallery, it's the research forum is part of the academic community, and we've gone all over the country with that too. So we are developing common patterns of working across both parts of the institution, or all parts of the institution, which I think is hopefully creating a culture which is what's going to be at our heart. We will never have the numbers of the National Gallery or the British Museum. We literally can't fit them in. We're relatively small. So what we have to think quite hard about what we do on site and what we want to do online, more online, which of course we've developed lots of over COVID, and how we aren't in competition with the big national museums. We can't be. We're not that sort of entity. But we want to be known for what we are and what we do, and to be known across the country as well. And obviously, we want international visitors too. But we know it's complete realism. That international visitors have their list, and they're going to go to the National Gallery and the V&A and the British Museum before they come to us. So they've got to have probably be in at least their second visit to London before they come to us. And you have to be sort of realistic about that. We're like the Wallace or the Soane or Dulwich. We're slightly more central than two of those, but we're not in competition in any sense. And what we need to do is do things slightly differently, have a slightly different agenda, and sort of have a different place on the cultural map, I think.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to pose a question or ask anything else?
Yeah. Okay. Devi,
Yes.
the wonderful thing that you people are doing in England, and but I, as an artist, stupidly indulged in making the collection, and I've shared baggage in Bhubaneswar. That's why the JD Center of Art is being built. Yes. And Siddharth has taken over and taken the trouble of looking after now, along with our trustees and advisory committee. So, number one, I'd like to request you to be a little more involved in the JD Center of Art, number one. Having said that, is there any possibility that we collaborate JD Center of Art with other art institutions in India? And also, can we, ours is a very little institution. Yours is a very wonderful, large, fully established institution. But could we also reach out to you for advice, input, and collaboration to you in the sense to your institution?
First of all, just say I'm tremendously honoured to be on your advisory board, and I'm ashamed that I've been able to play relatively little serious part in it to date. But I would love to do more in the future. Anything I can do personally, yes. But it would be very good to have that conversation and think about it. I think that I haven't got specific ideas at the moment, but I'm sure there are ways in which we can learn from you, which is what I think has been the most exciting thing in the partnerships that we've had to date. It's not, we're located in London, so we're located in London, but the really interesting thing has been the learning that we've got from others and listening. And I know we can learn a lot from you. I think you're tremendously brave, and as you know, and that I wish the centre huge amounts of well, because I think you're an artist donor, as it were, which is another really interesting concept and category of activity. I mean, you're in an honourable tradition, I think, Jatin. There's some other wonderful artists who in their different ways have done similar things, but not quite as you have done them and as you are doing them. But I love the fact that you have always conceived of the centre as very much for the community, for Odisha, for the locality, about bringing people their own heritage. That's tremendously important, and I salute you for that.
Because of our state, it's a good idea to do it there. But I think we have to also reach out to academic institutions for collaboration, other art and cultural institutions for collaboration. And we have no funds. So I'm selling my painting, books, and catalogs to raise a drop in the ocean, things like that.
Yeah, no,
there are a lot of learnings for us, I think, of how, like what Tasneem had asked you, about how the museum and the institute, the two very different entities that often are, there's a big severance in museums, where education is just one small part of the experience, but in your institution, it's such a big part, and they both exist side by side and together. And I think that's the learning, I think, for us, and we will reach out to you later, but I think a lot of institutions in India, I mean, I can see Anupam Sa, who's here, from CSMVS, and Tasneem, with Bhavda Jilad, and there's so many others, Sentila, who's working, Purnima Rai, who's working crafts, and but I think there's so much that we have to learn, because instead of how the adapting of the learnings can be applied, and to have the best practices, and how do we adapt it to our environment, because I've had a couple of students who've graduated from your college and have interned with me, so and we've kind of learned, for better or for worse, like how that pans out. But if there's anyone else who wanted to ask anything else, maybe. We don't want to hog you completely. Is
anybody?
Do you also want to talk, Debbie, a little bit about how does the whole education part of the Courtauld Institute pan out?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, basically, we are a higher education institution, like a mini university, but with a relatively small range of programs. And we sit alongside some of the conservative. I mean, in scale, we sit alongside some of the conservatoires in the UK. It's very typical for music. music practice, as it were, for there to be specialist colleges. So the Royal Academy of Music, the Royal College of Music, at a graduate level, the Royal College of Art, which is slightly larger. So we're in a category of specialist institutions, as they're called, within the higher education sphere in the UK. And as a result, we do get some we get some public funding in addition to the student fee income that is the core of the income. We have degree programs running from BA to PhD, and a very strong postgraduate taught set of cohorts. So if you look at the numbers we have, it's very, very crudely about, let's say if you took 500, we're a little bit more than 500, we're a bit close to 600. If it was 500, you'd have 200 undergraduates. No, sorry, we're going to have 300 undergraduats. We're going to have 600, about 200, 250 taught postgraduates, and about 75 to 100 are PhD students. So, and all taking courses either in art history, curating, or conservation of various sorts, and heritage management as well. We have a very interesting program which we're just restarting on Buddhist art, history, and conservation. So it's a sort of place which people need to be very passionate about the arts to come to. If you just want to have an undergraduate degree and an undergraduate experience of a normal sort, you probably wouldn't choose the Courtauld. You'd go to a bigger university with more campus life and so on. I mean, we are actually doing all we can to strengthen what we offer our students, particularly at undergraduate level. Postgraduates seem to be very comfortable and happy because by that time they're very focused on what they're trying to do and trying to achieve. And what they enjoy is the art world of London, which they then can access very readily. But for the undergraduates, we're trying to do everything we can to increase the things that we give to them around the edges of a student life. And then the PhD cohort is a fully sort of, almost professionalized, as it were, research community, which then interacts with the teaching, and that they start doing some teaching quite often in their latter years, getting some professional experience in that area and so on. And we have a faculty of about 40 or so overall core faculty, but quite a lot of people who will teach for us on shorter term contracts. So numerically, in terms of staff and weighting, that is the bigger element rather than the gallery and the curatorial team, which is more like sort of 14, 15 along. But then the support services run across the whole institution. You're on mute, I think, Jatinda.
Sorry, there's a question from Seema Bhalla. Seema Bhalla, would you like to ask the question yourself? Hello?
Yes, I would. This is, Debbie, this is regarding that wonderful statue of Edward Colston that you said was then saved and has been put on display. Now, what the picture showed was that the statue at the moment is been placed in a horizontal position with support under the head and also support under, I think, hip. But,
yeah, as far as I can see.
but the back remains without any support. So my just one question is that if the statue was intended to be erected in a vertical position, and if now it is lying in the position that it is with support under the head and under the hip and no support in between, can it in any way affect the material in terms of material fatigue in the portion that is not supported?
Seema, thanks so much. Lovely to hear your voice, but thank you so much for the question. I can't properly answer that because it's not in, this is in Bristol. It's nothing to do with the Courtauld. It was just an example of perhaps the most significant arts related event in the Black Lives Matter movement in the UK. I assume they will have. I assume they should have done all the technical studies to ensure that they are giving adequate support to that figure. I would be very surprised if they hadn't. It looks like it's a timber support system from what I could see from the image. So looks slightly temporary in a way. But I think there's such a huge debate in Bristol about what to do with the figure. I'm quite sure that those involved with the campaign must have felt what they needed to do was to make a move, whatever the move was, to make a move and do something proactive in relation to that very controversial statue, which they've done. But I would be very surprised if they hadn't taken technical advice or had technical people on their own teams before showing it. It is a metallic sculpture, I think, so it ought to be okay.
Thank you very much.
I'll find out more if I can.
Thank you.
There's from your neighborhood, there's Professor Richard Wish. I don't know if he wants to say it himself. Richard Wish, would you like to comment? Just put it in the chat box.
Can I ask a question also?
Yes, Sangeeta. If you could just go straight after Richard.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hello, I didn't have a particular question, but I was just going to say to Debbie that I went into Somerset House yesterday for the first time since the pandemic began. And I have to say, I had forgotten just what a magnificent position it occupies in London. And hearing you talk today is utterly inspiring because it just adds to what is already a wonderful position. So I wish you all the well, and I look forward to you being fully up and functioning.
Oh, thank you so much, Richard. That's very sweet of you to say that. It's I'll tell a nice story. Our architect was walking in a few weeks ago when we'd finished all the vestibule changes, and he was accosted by a lady there who turned out to be a regular visitor to the Courthold before it closed, came to our non-degree courses, to our talks, our lectures, our study courses and so on. And she said, but I don't know what the fuss about, what have you done? As he said, he was somewhat put out initially, but then she must have been a willing auditor, I think, but spent half an hour explaining to her exactly what that had all taken to do, and said that she was fully inspired by the end. But and also he felt that he'd been vindicated because, of course, that's exactly the reaction we want people to have, that at one level they come in and they don't see anything that's been done. But in fact, everything has been done. I mean, the building has been stripped down to basically its bare bones and redone.
In my years as a professor of law at King's, I have often lectured in your building, right up at the very top. And when you were talking about staircases, it suddenly all came back to me how far it is to get to the top of that building.
What were you teaching at that time? What was the gallery? Were you just visiting when you were teaching, or were you teaching in the gallery?
No, sometimes the law school actually borrowed rooms from you, in which I used to.
There we go. Yes. We should explain to the audience that the old King's Law School is immediately contiguous to our building, and in fact, that's the redevelopment that really could be the exciting one, Richard, couldn't it? With some sort of interconnection between the two. Yeah.
Anyway, nice to hear you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
And there's Sangeeta Dasgupta who had a question. Sangeeta, would you like to ask him?
Yes. Thanks a lot. Very, very interesting talk. Many things come to my mind. I really like the way you ended talking about a battle for arts, and belonging, as I do, to the discipline of history, as you know, battle for arts, battle for humanities, battle for history, trying to see that we still remain relevant. All these are huge issues before us. But I was trying to ask you a question, not from the point of view of just funding, but also from the point of view of how relevant you feel that art history still is today. Students who go, researchers who come to the field, that is also a challenge before us. Participation from those who would be visiting the galleries, volunteers who would be now coming in for something like art history. Do you find a change that has come about in the years, and you have a huge experience in this? That's the question that I had.
Really, really interesting question. Thank you so much, Sangeeta. I mean, that is for us the fundamental question, really, because in a sense we sort of stand for and we are justified by this concept of art history. I'm not personally so hung up on the words, but let's just keep the words as they are for what they are. It is the battle is a subset of the battle for the humanities. I agree, and the arts and humanities. It's a broader challenge. But what we've found is that. I mean, the battle, we are continuing to get really strong candidates to come into our degrees, and we're really pushing as hard as we can. We're doing everything we can to try and sort of broaden the, let's say, the sort of social base of our students. That remains still a challenge. I think it's why we are quite deliberately doing a number of things to make the subject more accessible. And one of those is visibly globalizing the curriculum, is as well globalizing certainly the contemporary relevance of the curriculum, and also, well, this will sound terribly what would I call it, sort of deliberate, but thinking of ways in which we can explain the relevance of doing art history as an example of the arts and humanities, and its relevance in terms of future employment, because that's what often parents, certainly undergraduates, are very concerned about, and certainly particularly parents of students who have not got a traditional, perhaps long-standing family background of university study. And we've got to find more ways of doing that. I mean, at one point we were doing some things with schools where we created postcards and they had sort of images and questions on them. And then when the students, these sessions we did with students, we allowed them to turn over the cards when they'd finished, and they just said, this is part of art history. This is art history, because the words art history sort of seem to put people off. Whereas in fact, one was dealing with the world of images, of looking at images, of understanding, looking at how they're created, looking at objects and how they're created, just understanding the creative process, understanding how people use them and so on. And so the language is one of the, can be seen as one of the biggest barriers. There's very little teaching of anything called art history in schools, even in the UK. And in fact, there is an A level, for those of you who are familiar with the school system in the UK, in art history, but it's taken by very few students, and it's virtually entirely in private schools, not in state schools. So one of the challenges that we're not alone. This is with universities across the country trying to think about is how we insert sort of materials and thinking into the teaching in other disciplines. I mean, certainly with history, obviously, but with languages, with literature, with sciences, with mathematics, and so on. But this is the battle. This is the war. It's to get beyond the restrictions of that linguistic framework to make sure that the thing that we are all comfortable in calling art history is something which is accessible to a much larger community, and they're not put off by something they see as narrow or elitist, and only relates to a certain sort of artistic product. But I think it's an ongoing challenge, and none of us are in the least bit complacent. And we all know all of my colleagues are exercised about it. At the Courtauld, we're doing well with our admissions, but we watch like hawks when we see that any other university department being threatened with closure or absorption into a larger one, and the pool of candidates applying is not getting larger. That's the strange thing. So there is in terms of getting people into this at university level, there's battles still there are battles.
Thank you, Debbie. Are there any other questions that anyone would like to pose? Debbie? I think, Prajna, you wanted to say something? Pragya Paramita? I don't know if
Hello, Siddharth. I just wanted to say hi to Debbie and thank her particularly for mentioning the pivotal role that my parents played in her whole life story. I'm saying hello from Cannes, where I am right now, and just greeting Jatin as well, and greeting Nandita, who I met here for the first time in Cannes at the film festival. Lovely to see you, Debbie. It's been a fabulous talk, and we'll be in touch.
We'll be in touch. I was going to reach out to you when I said farewell to everybody, but thank you for
That's
thank you
fine,
for
because I've got to go now, so we'll catch up on WhatsApp.
Lovely.
Take care. Bye, everyone.
Thank you. So before we say bye, and thank you, Debbie, for this lovely session and for agreeing to do this with us. I know I've kind of hankered you to get you, and I know you're very busy, but it's so lovely to have you. And I think also for us to have so many learnings, that we have, and I think many others on this forum, and they might reach out to you. I also wanted to just say that our next speaker, Debbie, is an old and dear friend of yours, Laila Tayyabji. And she's going to be talking about her whole journey and trajectory. And just in case anyone wanted to know more about GDCA, and hopefully, Debbie, when you come to India next, I hope it'll be on your route next or the time after that. And with that, thank you, everyone. And if you want to know more about GDCA, please do log on to our website and our social media handles. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye. Have a great weekend.
Thanks to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.